Alright, so, just to confuse you guys, we've talked a lot about membranes of cells. We've talked about membranes that you find in cells, the nuclear membranes, the membranes that make up the endomembrane system. We've talked about the cellular membrane and all of that sort of stuff. And just to confuse you, you're also going to hear me talk about a totally different type of membrane that has absolutely nothing to do with it. And the reason why we got these two words that mean basically the same thing is because membrane is just a word that means a thin covering or a thin divider. And the cell membrane was named by cell biologists who were studying cells, and now we're going to be talking about tissue membranes, which were studied by histologists who, at least in the early parts of science when all of this stuff was being figured out, didn't always talk to the cell guys. They hadn't quite figured out that whole thing yet. So there are a number of words that actually end up being reused to mean totally different things. So we're going to be talking about the other type of membrane today. So basically a membrane from a tissue perspective, a tissue membrane, is a layer of cells. And there are epithelial-only membranes, there are connective-only membranes, and there are mixed membranes. As you might guess, epithelial only are membranes that are made only of epithelial tissue. Connective only are made only of connective tissue. Mixed membranes are made of a mixture of epithelial and connective and sometimes muscular tissue, and usually smooth muscular tissue. So some membranes that are connective only would be the Dura Mater. Right? So the Dura Mater, the synovial membranes, the Periosteum. So the Dura Mater is a membrane that is found in your, basically your central nervous system. We'll talk about it more when we talk about nervous system stuff. It is a layer of connective tissue that basically surrounds your spinal cord and your brain actually, and serves to protect and anchor it. The periosteum is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that is a membrane that lies on top of your bone and that things connect to. Epithelial-only membranes would be the lens of the eye and the anterior surface of the cornea. Those are both epithelial-only membranes. The skin is considered to be a membrane. We're going to talk about this more next week when we talk about the integumentary system in our next section of the class. The skin is called the cutaneous membrane. Cutaneous means dealing with the skin, so it's the skin membrane, literally. And this is a mixed membrane, clearly because the skin has stratified squamous epithelium, which is your epidermis, and it has the connective tissue, which is your dermis. So it's a membrane. This is what's called a dry membrane because it's relatively dry. It's not seeping fluid all the time. There are many, many different types of membranes that we might talk about at some point during the class. There's a few that I want to highlight right now. A mucous membrane, or your mucosa. This is something that we're going to talk about over and over and over and over and over. It is basically a mixed membrane. It has a layer of connective tissue. And a layer of epithelial tissue, usually, though not always, simple columnar or pseudostratified columnar tissue, and it has special mucus-producing cells called goblet cells. So here you can see, I'm going to outline this goblet cell here in red. And the goblet cells produce mucus. Mucus is a mixture of polysaccharide and water. And when you mix a thick polysaccharide and water, basically what you get is snot. It could be thick snot, it could be thin snot, but it's snot. That's what mucus is. And usually, though again, not always, you have your epithelial cells ciliated, and they're ciliated so that they can basically move the mucus around. This is much more common in the mucous membranes that are found in your lungs and your respiratory tract. Not common, for instance, in the mucous membrane in your stomach. Your stomach's not a very nice environment for cilia. They would tend to get destroyed there. Sometimes you'll find the cilial layer, sometimes you won't. As we always see with epithelia, they rest on top of a thin basement membrane. So that's a membrane inside of a membrane. We're getting like totally meta here. So here we are, a membrane inside of a membrane, the basement membrane, which is this thin layer of connective tissue. It doesn't even contain any cells. It's just fibers of the connective tissue. That's what the epithelium is anchored onto. And then you have a connective tissue layer called the lamina propria, which is mostly areolar tissue. And through that you have like blood vessels and collagen fibers and elastin fibers and fibroblasts and white blood cells and macrophages and nerves and stuff like that running. And then for most, though not all mucous membranes, you have a third layer, which is the Muscularis Mucosae, which is actually a thin layer of smooth muscular tissue that can move the mucosa. And specifically in this case, that can actually cause the mucosa to constrict or to wrinkle. The mucous membranes, you got mucous membranes all throughout the inside of your body. They line the inside of your mouth, they line your throat, your stomach, your esophagus, your intestines, all the way out the other end. They line the insides of your trachea and your lungs. Basically, anywhere that the outside body can contact you that is technically inside your body. Your reproductive tract, the inside of the vagina if you're female, the urethral insides a little bit less, so that's not really mucous membrane. The functions of this are absorptive and secretory, right? So it absorbs things from the lumen, whatever empty area this epithelium is facing, into the epithelial cells, and then into the blood. They secrete things. They secrete mucus, first off, and some of these have like glandular functions. They'll secrete other things as well. And protective. Mucus is actually filled with antibodies, and it helps to protect your body from invasion. Another example of a membrane is the Serous Membrane, or Serosa. This is a simple squamous epithelial layer, so a single layer of squamous epithelial tissue resting on a thin layer of areolar tissue. So here you see simple squamous, thin layer of areolar tissue. That's basically the basement membrane right there. And this produces serous fluid. So it excretes and secretes fluid into this cavity area. And you may or may not have smooth muscle on the outside. It depends on the nature of the serous membrane. The serous membrane lines most body cavities. So endothelium lines your blood vessels, the inside of your blood vessel, and your heart is this endothelial serous membrane. Mesothelium lines body cavities, like your pericardial cavity, your peritoneal cavity, your pleural cavity, things like that. So when I use the word membrane and I start talking about mucous membranes or serous membranes or basement membranes and stuff like that, I want you to know that I'm not talking about a cellular membrane. Same word, totally different meaning. Just to recap, you should know what the tissue membrane is. You should know that membranes can be connective only, epithelial only, or mixed. And you should know the two examples that we talked about here of mixed membranes, the serous membrane and the mucous membrane.